Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see so many familiar and new faces on these calls. Welcome to Race in PR Classroom, Best Strategies, Practices, and Tools, presented by the Institute for Public Relations and the Educators Academy. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Tina McCorkindale, and I'm the president and CEO at the Institute for Public Relations. And thanks to my co-partner, Dean Mundy, who is the chair of the PRSA Educators Academy. Wave, Dean. And who's been a great partner for this project. So today, this is our second series. I'd like to welcome today's host. We have Stephanie Mahin. She's a clinical assistant professor of management and corporate communication at UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School. Long on her business card. It's a very long title. And then we have Nneka Logan, who's associate professor at Department of Communication at Virginia Tech University, and Natalie Asode, who is a lecturer of PR and social media at the University of Florida. So thanks to our three panelists for joining us. Today's session is one of a three-part series, which we're turning into a monthly series for educators. And our goal is to focus on understanding issues of race in higher education, and specifically to think about best practices, strategies, and tools for addressing race in the classroom and looking long-term and how, as David Brown said on the call last week, this is a marathon and not a sprint. But we want to think about how to create systemic change, particularly creating a more diverse PR faculty and more diverse pipelines of practitioners or students. So before we begin, I have a few housekeeping rules. So I'd like to remind you that this is a Q&A type of forum. To ask a question, you can open the chat box at the bottom of your screen and virtually raise your hand. So you can see that at the bottom, you can raise your hand and a little hand pops up on the screen. I think we've been in Zoom for a while. Once you're called on, please remember to state your name and organization. If you would like to send a question anonymously, you can type the message to the host or to send it to Dean Mundy, and he will read your question aloud. Dean, will you wave one more time? Hey. All right, and only the moderators will see your question. You're also more than welcome to ask a question in the chat box to everyone, and the moderator or the panelists will also be reviewing that as well. And just note that we will be compiling any resources that you share, and we will include those after on the website. And we did that with last week's discussion. If you didn't check out last week's discussion, that's also on the IP website. If you are tweeting about the discussion, please use the hashtag RPRC, that's RPRC. The discussion is being recorded and will be available for playback on the IPR website, and we will send you an email when that playback is available the next couple of days. And Dean's giving additional notes about the raise your hand feature because I can't see it because I'm a host, so thank you, Dean. And then also, please remain respectful to our host and others by keeping yourself muted at all times unless you intend to speak, ask the question. So we'll start with Stephanie, and then we'll Nneka, and then Natalie. So Stephanie, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much. I appreciate everyone taking time to participate in this conversation because, again, that's exactly what it is. If you joined us last week, it was an amazing foundation that was set for moving into the conversation today. And so I think a lot of what I'll say just over these next just minute or two that I'll take is really sort of segueing from that conversation and into this conversation about strategies. And so I'm going to start the conversation a bit more broadly. Once the conversation sort of swings back my way, then I'll certainly give thoughts about at least one tangible that I think is really important to consider as we're talking about strategies and tactics to use in the classroom. But I really wanted to first start with talking to and about us as educators, because as PR educators, some of our curricula have been on autopilot for quite a long time. Our readings, our assignments, our guest speakers, and truthfully, it really is probably because it's just been easy, right? It's been the easy thing to do, semester to semester, quarter to quarter, year to year. But if you think about where your course stands today, who does it really serve, right? Does it really serve our students? Does it serve our students of color, the few that you may have in class? And so based on the events of the last month or more, many educators have been certainly looking to make changes, to improve their situation in the classroom. So as we process everything that's happening around us, because there's a lot going on, and as we begin to think about and look toward the fall semester, I have a few questions for you to consider that you can ask yourself first before you sort of dive into making some of the changes and recommendations, suggestions that'll be mentioned throughout the next hour. And so Alice Walker, who's an author, obviously some of you are very familiar, some of you may not be familiar with who she is, but she said, go to the places that scare you. So that's what I'm asking you to do as educators. Go to the places that scare you, and do that by considering at least 4 things. Being confrontational with yourself. What I mean by be confrontational with yourself is confront and address your own unconscious biases that sort of reflect and reinforce systems of oppression. Confront your attitude towards cultural differences. Confront your current knowledge base of different cultural practices and worldviews, or a lack thereof, right? Sort of know what you don't know. And then the second thing is to be authentic, transparent, and open with your students. They can sort of see through you muddling through, trying to figure things out on the fly, right? So be sure that you address any conscious or unconscious low expectations or assumptions, even that you may have about, say, students of color. Remember, not all of your students of color, not all of them come from low income or urban neighborhoods. Not all of them are on special scholarships. Not all of them are first gens, right? Black students know when they are seen and when they're not seen. And their stories, the stories of your students of color, are just as varied as our white students. The third thing I sort of challenge you to do is be aware. Be aware of the power of your position to advance equity and to act on it. Be aware of your position as an educator, as a faculty advisor, as a department administrator, and as a mentor. And then the last thing is, I like to say, sort of be an accountability advocate, if you will, and be an accountability advocate of yourself and your colleagues. Don't be afraid to sort of ask, what can I do to address anti-Black racism in my personal life, as well as a colleague? How can I immediately support my Black, Indigenous, people of color colleagues, of which there are probably a few, but ask, what can I offer that's going to fully sort of honor them and meet their needs? What are my department's short, mid, and long-term commitments for moving forward to address anti-Blackness? Last week, I was in a conversation and I heard this quote that I thought was great. And the person said, silent allies aren't allies. They are just people in the room. Allies are the ones that actually speak up, okay? So once we sort of check ourselves as individuals and sort of work through some of these things, then we can sort of present our best selves to our students in the classroom and begin to provide them with the inclusive teaching practices and the education that they deserve.
Okay, Nneka?
Yes. All right. Hi, everybody. So thank you so much for being here today. Thank you, Tina and Dean, and the entire team for organizing this. It's such a pleasure to be here with you and share in what is really, really an important and happily now ongoing discussion about things that need to be said and talked about. So I want to pick up where Stephanie left off a little bit in talking about how to confront yourself and silent allies, and kind of bring forth some of my thoughts on these issues. So I think it's interesting. All of us have a race, yet race is so difficult for us to talk about. All of us are human beings, but we have trouble sometimes bringing our full humanity into the classroom and facilitating others to do that. I think when you're talking about race, you're really talking about humanity. And the way I approach teaching race in the PR classroom, the first thing I try to do is establish an atmosphere of mutual respect. between myself and the students and each other. I think establishing a trusting environment where everyone feels safe to share their ideas, even if their ideas are different, is absolutely critical. I think, as Stephanie mentioned, the idea of silent allies, right? Silent allies, if they're really allies, are silent because they don't either know what to say or they're scared to say, and they don't know how they're going to be perceived. So one of the things I think is really important, at least for me when I teach race, and I teach race and PR, and I've done it in a more multicultural institution at Georgia State University where I earned my Ph.D., but also here at Virginia Tech. It's a predominantly white institution. I wonder sometimes, does my race, do they see my race before they see me? And how will that affect how they receive my teaching? But I have no control over that. What I do have control over as a teacher is the atmosphere that I set in the classroom and help us all to create. So with that said, I invite students to bring their worldviews, to let them know, even if it's something totally different from my view or their classmates' view, that's okay. We're not necessarily here to convince each other. We're here to engage in a discussion and a dialogue and see where that goes. Now, I feel validated if later on they come back to me or stop by during office hours and say, hey, I was talking with my friend yesterday in the gym, in the dorm room about this, that, or the other. Then I'm like, aha. But none of us, in my opinion, in the classroom, I'm not there to convince them of a particular viewpoint, but I am there to facilitate their discovery through our discussion. And the way I begin that, the way I like to do it, is by just establishing very early on an atmosphere of mutual respect where everybody's viewpoint is welcome, even if it's different, so long that it's respectful. You can discuss almost anything. So those are my ground rules for the class. And for me, where I know a good bit of my students have very conservative views, I want them to still feel safe. If they don't, then we're never going to talk. If we don't talk, we never can create any positive change. The second thing that I find helps us talk about race in the classroom is not necessarily sharing our own ideas, because sometimes those are things people feel comfortable doing only around their own kitchen tables, only at the bar with their buddies. But I find that if I can use a surrogate to get them talking about race, they will talk more about that. And the surrogate I typically use is some form of something that happened in the real world, in the news, some form of a corporate communication campaign, some form of corporate discourse. So some of the things that I've shared with my class, or the classes that I teach, are Randall Stevenson, AT&T CEO, a few years ago, I think 2016, gave a speech on why he supported Black Lives Matter. And he actually disclosed the fact that his best friend was a Black person. But even though this was true, he never thought much about race. So I might share an example like that in the classroom. I might share an example like the Starbucks Race Together campaign, or even the diversity training that they did after the racial profiling incident, or and I have several others, and I can share them as resources. I share them in the classroom, and because it's a PR classroom, I then I divide the students up or let them self-select groups, and then I ask them how they would manage this situation from a PR perspective. Are you going to try to convince someone that your particular, are you advocating for the organization's perspective to persuade the audience that what the organization is saying about race, supporting Black Lives Matter, is the right thing? Or are you adopting the perspective that says, how can I clean up this mess that my organization has created by supporting Black Lives Matter? And then I find when they think about it through a public relations theory perspective, say something like insider activist, that concept, Dorina Holtzhausen, and then also Donalyn Pomper and others who've worked in that insider activist space, when they think through that, or think it through from a fully functioning society or dialogic, you can pick your PR theory. Now, all of a sudden, they're talking about race, they're talking about difference, but they're talking about it through the vehicle of the public relations text, which makes them more comfortable. So those are two of the things that I've found work for me, and I'll now be quiet and turn it over to my colleague, Natalie, and happy to answer questions about this and continue the dialogue.
Thank you so much, Nneka. Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie Asore, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm a lecturer at the University of Florida, and I'm also the advisor to the Hispanic Public Relations Student Association. So I come to this conversation as an ally. I think it's important to tell you that I identify as a Latina and a woman of color, but I also recognize that because of the color of my skin, I've been afforded privilege. And that's an important conversation to have, because I think we often think of the Latinx community as one, and there is a lot of racism and classism that exists within this community itself. And so I think this segues to my first point, which is I like to acknowledge my identity and the intersectionality of my identities in the classroom, and I do it early on. I think that it creates an opportunity for the students to know my perspective and for them to feel safer to share their perspective as well. And it also does a really good job of helping me identify, to Stephanie's point, confront ourselves and our biases and who we are, but also identify where are the gaps and who do I need to bring into the classroom that has different perspectives than I do, that has different lived experiences than I do, to help tell those stories and to show our students that there are, multiple perspectives out there and multiple ways to be successful in this industry. The other piece, and this is something that I heard yesterday at a student town hall, was there was a student of color who mentioned that often, especially in our predominantly white institutions, she's one of 3 in a classroom who's a student of color. And she will get singled out to share her perspective as if her perspective is inclusive of or indicative of what the entire community feels or thinks. And when we single out our students of color, and sometimes I think this may happen inadvertently, we need to be cognizant of that, because it puts an undue pressure on them to represent a community that they should not have to deal with. And I know personally, both in the industry and in the 2 years that I've been at UF, that I've had this feeling myself as a Latina and a member of the faculty. And so I want to just remind us all to be mindful not to ask one person to represent an entire community, and to lean on that one student to teach us or to teach the class, when we should be the ones providing those resources. I think Nneka just shared some incredible examples of work. As we think about the case studies that we bring into the classroom, I want to encourage us to shy away from those moments where an organization is celebrating a particular month of heritage. So, here's so-and-so celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month, or here's so-and-so celebrating Black History Month. I think it's always a good start, and we should be celebrating and honoring our cultures in those moments. I think we can go further. And often what we find in those case studies is that they're examples of pandering to our communities versus actually investing and celebrating and honoring our communities. And so to do this, I think it's going to require that we look beyond just the lists of award-winning campaigns at, who are the people and organizations that are doing work in our communities and that have been investing in them for years, not just the result of, one moment that prompts a statement or that prompts a donation to the NAACP. There has to be more, and I'm happy to share some examples of that. Another tool that I find helpful is, and perhaps this is because I advise the Hispanic PR Student Association, and while I was a student at UF, I was an ambassador for the Institute of Hispanic Latino Cultures. And I found that as a student, I didn't connect with my cultural identity in the public relations major or in the department or in the college. So I went and looked for that elsewhere. And I find that our students are often trying to do the same. We're lucky to have the first chapter of HPRSA at UF. We have the second chapter of the Black Public Relations Student Society at UF. We have an APIA group, but our students sometimes don't know that these are there as resources. And we should be pushing them outside of just those organizations that exist within our departments to understand what else is available. You know, we have incredible chapters of NAHJ and NABJ at our college, and there's no reason why our public relations students should not be engaging and creating relationships with those students as well. And even outside of the departments, outside of the college, at the university at large, become informed of what are the efforts that are happening with multicultural and diversity affairs. What programming are they putting on? How are they helping students from underrepresented communities be themselves and understand themselves within these systems that oppress them? How do they create these opportunities for them and share that in the classroom? So I use the classroom as a vehicle to inform my students of all these activities or events that are going on both within the organizations and the department, but also more broadly at what's happening in the college. I had an assignment one time in my PR writing class where they were writing a media alert, and that weekend, the weekend of the assignment, the Institute of Hispanic Latino Cultures and the Institute of Black Cultures at UF were doing a reopening. And so I had them write their alert on this information. And I found that the majority of my students didn't even know that this was happening on campus. And so it was just, and that's just an awareness, right? That's just like, let me tell you what's happening and the resources that exist here. And I think that that is helpful to the students of color to know that, one, you are in tune and that you care, but also to our white students who may not be as familiar. And the last thing I'll say is I've also had the honor of working on a couple of, or co-teaching a couple of classes that have been, the student response has been incredible. One of them was the Diverse Voices class, which I co-taught with Marcia DiStazo, who's on the call, Pat Ford, and Vanessa Wakeman, who's actually one of the voices featured in the Diverse Voices book. So we actually used the PRSA Foundation book as the guide for that course, and didn't just have them read the stories, which are incredible, but actually engage them in activities that encourage them to sort of step out of their comfort zones and really try to better understand the experiences of their peers. One activity I led was a privilege walk with the students, and you know, it was important for us also to offer them the opportunity to opt out of that activity in case they felt uncomfortable. But those who did, and the conversations that resulted after that activity, really sort of, they moved us. And then this fall, I'll be co-teaching We Are CJC, so College of Journalism and Communications course. It's gonna be an interdisciplinary course that brings together advertising, PR, and production students to tell the stories of the diverse faculty and staff at our college. And so we're working with our students to better understand who the faculty and staff are and be able to communicate and amplify the voices. And that was led by Professor Reagan Burden in our advertising department. And she led that starting with Black History Month and said, this is just the very beginning. We're gonna do this across the board. So I also encourage you all to think about, you know, are there opportunities like that beyond, of course, diversifying the curriculum across all of our courses, which has to be, I think that has to be number one. How do we also create other opportunities for students to engage in this work in real time and with us in the classroom?
Great, thank you. Thank you to all three of you. So we'll now open it up for questions. Just a reminder to use the raise your hand feature on the participants button at the bottom. And so while you were thinking about questions, actually we had one question from Jean Sandlin in the chat. And she was asking, Natalie, can you share what the privilege walk assignment looked like?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to share that as a resource. And I'll talk you through it just briefly, and know that there are criticisms of this assignment too. So none of this comes, you know, but none of it is perfect, but essentially in the assignment, you have one person who reads out statements such as, I have never been discriminated by the color of my skin, or I have never had to worry about where my next meal would come from. I grew up in a 2-parent household. Those kinds of statements you read and you ask students to take a step forward if a certain statement applies to them, or to take a step back. And it becomes very clear how different our experiences have been. And this was an activity that I learned about because of my involvement when I was a student. The University of Florida puts on a diversity leadership retreat, and you engage in all sorts of activities that really encourage you to step outside of your comfort zone and sit and stand and work in your discomfort. And so we thought, as we were developing the courses and thinking of ways that we can get our students to have conversations beyond just, whatever they were reading, that was one of the activities that was really helpful. And we walked outside and did it outside, and then all came back into the classroom and talked about what that meant and how they felt depending on where they stood in the privilege walk. And there was one student, and it's an emotional activity, which is, it's challenging to lead those or to be a part of those. One of the students said, there was nowhere else for her to go back. Like, she couldn't step further back. And just sharing that perspective in the classroom was very vulnerable and very powerful.
Great, thank you, Natalie. I don't see any hands raised yet on the participant thing, but I did have a question. Is it okay if I go ahead and ask a question of the 3 panelists? And this is something that I always struggle with personally in the classroom, but I think it's a really important question that we all need to ask is, I teach the principles of PR class, right? And there are about 200 people in that class. And how do I try every term to better integrate diversity throughout the term, but a lot of times I see syllabi and talk to different faculty who were like, there's a diversity week or a diversity class, and that's where everything was put in. What are some strategies that we can all use in terms of trying to better put diversity as like throughout the curriculum, throughout the term? Are there certain things that we should be looking for as we're preparing our classes so that it's not a diversity week, that it is present throughout? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a lot. Nneka, did you want to just maybe start us off, or?
I forgot to unmute myself. So, okay. Well, one of the things that I like to do is integrate the work of diverse scholars throughout the semester. So whatever we're talking about, it, there's somebody of some diverse background that's also, that can fit that week. So scholars of different races, different ethnicities, different orientations, whatever it is, I think there's no reason why they need to be aggregated at the end of the semester or during that one diversity week unless we choose to, right? So I think there's so many wonderful resources now that are pointing us to scholars of color whose work doesn't necessarily address race, or even if it does, it can be in that week. But I guess the point that I'll try to succinctly make is that we can incorporate the work of diverse scholars anytime throughout the semester. You just have to find the work, put it in the syllabus. And so I think that's one thing. I also, because the work of diverse scholars has been so marginalized in the field, I still do like the idea of having diversity week where we do focus on that, because then we can still focus on some specialized issues that you may not otherwise. But I think that if the work of diverse scholars, women scholars, is integrated throughout the entire semester, then also when you get to Diversity Week, it introduces a new context. It's not jarring, and it doesn't make the work of diverse scholars appear as if all we do is diverse work. Like, I study race. I love race. It's one of my favorite things to explore, but that's not all I do. I do many different things. And so I think when we integrate the work of scholars of color, diverse scholars in any way throughout the curriculum, that's also a show of equality and a show of equity that makes a statement to the students.
Nneka, I agree wholeheartedly with sort of what you've said. And one of the things that kind of bugs me just a little bit. I mean, I'm all for Diversity Week, but I do think that it can be a form of othering if in fact we're not doing what you're suggesting and what Natalie has suggested in terms of making sure that our scholars of color are sort of incorporated throughout our syllabi, right? Throughout the readings. We know that some of our PR textbooks sort of fail to implement culturally relevant and responsive, inclusive pedagogy. So if the textbooks themselves aren't working for us entirely, then we should really concentrate on relevant readings, or at least supplementing that text with those readings. I mean, sometimes that means going outside of our discipline to find out who these scholars are. One example that I'll give that I think about when I think about how to diversify the curriculum, I'm just going to use him as an example. Please do not send me hate mail. But Edward Bernays, as an example, is regarded as like the pioneer, right, of public relations. His influence radically changed the persuasion tactics used in campaign advertising as well as political campaigns. He's also called the father of public relations. But what happens if instead we think of Bernays as something else, right? Something, instead of the father of or the pioneer of, just one of many who influenced PR as we know it. Because as a person of color, when I hear someone is the pioneer of, someone is the father of, what you're saying to me in my mind is this person is the one that began or developed something new and prepared the way for others to follow. And so what does this do? This, you know, we start with Bernays or someone like him, and then we shut out all of those that may have come before him. And many of those folks are people of color, right? And so who might those people be? Well, if we look outside the discipline and we begin to read about tactics used in political campaigns, for an example, you might find that Ida B. Wells Burnett might be someone who could be considered someone who used PR tactics to really help develop campaigns to promote women's suffrage and, you know, the abolition of lynching, right? So she crafted rhetorical appeals to sort of change public opinion, not only in America, but as well as in Europe. So again, looking sometimes outside of our discipline to sort of find readings to supplement some of the PR principles that we are trying to enforce in our students is really going to be helpful in trying to diversify our curriculum.
Great, thank y'all. So we have a couple of questions. One, and David Brown has his hand raised. So David, we'll get to you in just 1 second, because Erica asked first, do you have suggestions of how to do this sort of work in the contemporary landscape of digital pedagogy?
Yeah, I'll start. And okay, I'm not muted this time. Good, working this way. But yeah, I think that's a great question. And what I found, I thought it would be much harder to talk about issues of race and difference in the digital landscape. But I think because so many of our students are digital natives, they enjoy it better. So I love throwing up a discussion question. Hey, what do you think about this? And then let them go, right? What do you think about, like, I'm not teaching right now, but I'm summer. But in the fall, I'm collecting all these corporate examples of statements related to supporting Black Lives Matter, so on and so forth. But then I'll ask them to think, to evaluate those statements. What do they think about that? Is it a moral or ethical position? Is it self-serving? So I find facilitating discussions, it's a very simple tool, and you probably already know that. You're like, why is she telling us that? But sometimes we forget the simple things, but some of those simple tactics, just a discussion, can be very, very effective. Responding to a video, responding to a campaign, I find in a digital environment has great legs. That dog will hunt.
Great, Natalie or Stephanie?
I was going to add, Nneka, to your point, sometimes I'll have students share what they consider, we'll kind of break it down into like the good, the bad, the ugly, and just discuss why they thought something was really great, a great example of a statement or solidarity, and why something was not, and then addressing beyond the initial sort of social media statement. Was there action that was taken? Was there a follow through in some way, or did it end at that? And sort of having the conversation about how does that evolve. So I had one student in particular who is going to be starting at PepsiCo this summer, and mentioned that she was disappointed in not seeing, a statement from Pepsi, but also recognizing or saying, if Pepsi came out and said something right now, it would be so disingenuous considering the, Kendall Jenner commercial just a couple years ago. And so having some of those conversations and allowing for them to sort of unpack the statements that are being made and whether they feel that those are honest or not, or just, trying to placate the situation in some way has been really helpful. And I just will use a Google Doc and have them sort of plug and play on something like that.
Yeah, and just, I agree with both of what Natalie and Nneka said in terms of how they approach that. For myself, in my, for example, a corporate social advocacy course that I teach, I might bring up a particular case, but I'll sort of backwalk the race issue into it. For example, if it's Starbucks and folks are protesting what happened to the gentleman in Philadelphia, we'll talk about the issue as a whole, and then I might begin to, again, sort of sprinkle in, well, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Do you think protest should have happened? Do you think that was racially motivated? Do you, what are your thoughts? Excuse me. And throughout the course, I try to really make it a point of always saying, remember, we are not here to convince each other of anything, right? Like I always feel like that's important to reinforce, because there are some students who sort of feel like, okay, this class was just designed to get me to think a certain way. No. That is not the design of the class. And so I feel it's important for me anyway, when I teach this particular course, that I'm always sort of reinforcing. Remember, we're not here to convince you of anything, but I do want you to be open to hear other points of view, because it might reinforce what you think, but then it also might cause you to say, oh, I never considered that way of thinking.
Great, thank you. David Brown had his hand raised. I don't see him on my screen, but David?
Yep, thanks, Dean. I just wanted to just ask the panelists also, and Stephanie just mentioned about the Starbucks incident, which happened in Philadelphia, and I see from my other Temple colleagues who are on this call, we tend to teach, all of us as professors tend to teach from the news cycle, and I'd love to hear the panelists' perspective of sometimes the spontaneity of the moment, because we've been talking about almost case studies, how things happen, but we do know that come September, we will still be in a very volatile environment, and how we might be able to think about using some of those moments while providing space for students to express what they need to express, but also taking it as a live teaching moment. So I'd love to hear everyone's response to that.
I think, at least for me, it's a challenge to think, like, what is the world even going to look like in September. Things are changing so dramatically. So I am thinking about that, but how would the way we discuss George Floyd's death and what that has triggered for our field in combination of COVID, I think the moment we're in is one specific historical moment. Where we are in September will be a different one, but I think it's incumbent upon us as scholars to keep, our nose in the book, but also our ears to the street so that we can provide appropriate context so that we can use these as teachable moments. Because I think if we don't, then our silence makes us complicit. And if no one else knows better, we've got to know better. So I don't have the answer to your question, but I'm thinking about it all the time. How am I going to teach this and what it means for our field and what it means, even though I'm interested maybe in corporate PR, but what does it mean beyond, what does this mean for the public in public relations? What does this mean for society and the work that we do? So that's an ongoing thought, and I'm glad you asked that question. I don't have an answer except for to say it's something I'll be thinking about, and I think it's something we all need to be thinking about. We can't let the moment miss us.
Well said. Because there's going to be a lot of unpacking to do, right? There will be students who maybe have not had a great opportunity to express themselves. Obviously there are a lot of students that are doing a lot of that now through the movements, but there's just going to be probably just a lot of feelings just all around. And so, yeah, like Nneka said, just, keeping our nose in the books and our ear to the street, I think is a beautiful way to put it.
Our students have been hosting their own town halls also and conversations. So the Black Student Union, for example, has hosted several conversations. And I asked if I could just listen in and join the conversation, for example. And for me, it felt like a show of solidarity, but also just, I want to know how they're feeling. I want to, and that's one way that I'm trying to keep my ear to the streets, is just being a part of those conversations with the students and learning from them also.
I'll add this.
Thank you. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just
No, go ahead.
I was just going to add this. I think one thing that I think in the context of race, I think students will be looking for our leadership as scholars, specifically. I have not ever, I'm not that old. I wasn't around for the civil rights movement. Not that there's anything wrong with that, not age shaming, but I have never seen such multicultural, multiracial support like I have seen for issues and causes of racial justice as I've seen right now. So I think one of the things that students will be looking for is how to contextualize that. So some of my student allies that are white and not silent are like, hey, I went and marched. Hey, I went and protested. They're telling me these things, I think, because they're signaling to me, I support the cause of justice, and what else do you think I should do? So back to David's question, it's continued to make me think, but how can we show support for students that are, in my case, Black like me, but also students that are different from me, that are white, that are Asian? One thing we haven't talked about, and we had a teach-in here in Virginia Tech, was to figure out how Black people, all manner of people, could support the rash, really, of anti-Asian violence that was going on, in response to COVID. Some of the students shared they did not feel safe going anywhere alone. So I think now is a time to think about the significance of race and how our field might impact positive change. And, not just say it, but do it, act on it.
Great, thank you, Nneka. Greg Feisman has his hand raised, and then Natalie Tyndall had a question.
Yeah, thanks, Dane. I just want to add on to what David and Nneka said and point out that there are some other things ongoing in the fall that will overlap or overlay these issues. One being the presidential election. I mean, that's going to impact all the things we're talking about. And then the after effect of whatever the election outcome is. So certainly the fight for racial justice and social equity, you know, these issues are not going away, and they're not going to be over with by the end of the fall semester. So, you know, if we take all of this in and encompass, I think it actually, while it may make us have to think a little harder, these are, pardon the very trite and overused phrase, these are all teachable moments that are happening right now in real time that are not only going to impact students in the classroom, it's going to impact their lives. And if we want to emphasize Nneka and some other people's points, if we want to raise the awareness of our students about not only activism, not only advocacy, because the social justice movements have PR people behind them who are helping to do these actions. I don't know that a lot of students realize Black Lives Matter has PR people, right, you know, on staff. It also, it gives them an opportunity to look for a career direction they may not have thought of before, but also if they go into NGOs or corporate, you know, we are hoping that this generation of PR students are going to be the ones that help affect change, because in 10, 15 years, when they are in leadership positions, not only will they be counseling senior management, they may be senior management. They can be the change they want to have happen. So I think it's really important for us as educators to think very holistically and long range when we're talking about these things, because these are more than just lessons in the classrooms. These are life lessons. These are society lessons.
Great. Thank you, Greg. So the next question, for those of us who are in small departments where maybe 1 to 2 people are the PR program and doing all of the teaching and all of the advising, how can we implement some of these recommendations without getting into redundancy? So how does this apply in terms of the smaller departments? Anyone want to take that one? I think we're probably, all the 4 of us are probably in larger departments as well. So that's a tough one.
It is a tough one.
Is anyone from a smaller department? That wants to, I mean, I can think through. I mean,
yes, I am.
Okay.
Kathy Rogers from Loyola University in New Orleans.
Okay.
I would worry about fatigue, right? Sort of setting in. You know, if there's a 2-person, for an example, you know, department trying to handle this, I mean, wow, that's a lot. It's a lot. And if one of those 2, let's say, is a person of color, it's a lot. So I would be interested in hearing. I would now. I don't have the answer to that. I would definitely like to hear from someone from a smaller department who might have some thoughts.
Hi, everyone. This is Natalie Tyndall. I'm the one that actually asked that question through a back channel to Tina McCorkindale, because I am one of 2 people teaching public relations that's tenured full-time in my department. Also, I am a person of color. I'm Black. And so it is incredibly hard to constantly be talking about these issues and constantly doing these things on top of all the other responsibilities. So I'm just curious if there's anybody from a small department who wants to talk about this, let me know, because we need to band together and help each other out, because it's a lot.
This is Jean Sandlin from California Lutheran University, small department. I'm in a Hispanic serving institution. And one of the things that I would say is integration in the case studies and the scholarship is key, so that it doesn't look like it's an appendage to the discussion, but actually integrated into the curriculum and the scholarship. So I try to put it in every class that we teach, but try to integrate best as we can. So that it doesn't look, like I said, so it doesn't look like an appendage, but it's actually intentional.
I think one thing I'll piggyback off of what Natalie said that might be helpful is the idea of community, right? So I'm not in a small department. I don't know what that is like, but the idea of community that Natalie said got me to thinking, what can we do as a community of PR scholars concerned about these issues due to equip? Exactly, I see David Brown's comments. I saw just a bit of what you said, but yeah, what can we do as a community to support smaller departments? Is it guest speaking? Is it sharing, you know, activities that we've already done that are fully packaged and ready to go? Is, you know, what can we do as a community of scholars to support our smaller institutions? I think it's a great question.
And I have a question. Is there any type of like a PR Speakers Bureau list or anything that exists that perhaps folks from smaller areas or even larger areas can sort of pull from and say, you know, hey, would you mind speaking to, you know, my class about whatever this topic area is that you...
Paige had this is Tina. Paige had a list of speakers that, you know, from both from corporate. Perfect. And reach out to them and specifically ask if we could find out like guest speakers by the BIPOC, so they can include those as well. Because I think it's really important just to have that resource and database that people can rely on that's consistent. And I know the Diversity Action Alliance which is, if anyone's not familiar with the Diversity Action Alliance, it's a group of a bunch of the industry associations that form together to focus on diversity. And the main focus is a commitment, and 40 companies have already signed that commitment that looks at building diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout all cycles in business. But they are working on a resource center that specifically will have a list of knowledge experts. So that may be another resource as well that we can share out once they get that together. But I'll reach out to Paige and see if they can do something about that.
Great. Kathy Rogers had her hand raised. Kathy?
Thank you. As I mentioned, I'm from Loyola in New Orleans, and I reiterate the importance and value of having guest speakers who are people of color. Certainly it's important to invite them not to just talk about diversity and inclusion, but just as experts on every other issue in our field. But my question from the point of view of a small program, and I'm the faculty advisor for PRSSA, and of course at a small program we have a very small membership, and a couple of years ago my Black women students were pushing to start a separate chapter for
I think we're having some technical. Am I the only one? No. I think we've lost Kathy. Is that right? All right, let's go ahead. So Kathy, I think that something's up with your Wi-Fi. So I hate to, but Abby, you had your hand raised.
I just thought one of the silver linings for me about COVID was that we had
people of color.
Sorry.
And while idea, I'm jealous of university putting my question in the chat.
Sorry about that.
Thanks. Thanks, Kathy. Abby, go ahead.
We're all doing the best we can with Zoom, right? It's
right.
Right now. One of the silver linings for me was realizing that I could really use my online classroom to supplement and deepen the classroom content and experience they were having. And one thought that I've thrown around would be seeing if there would be some of us on here, and feel free to let me know if you're interested, who would ever want to weigh in together over Zoom and record it about something that's happening right now. I find that my students are so interested, right? In Dr. Leventis, what do you think about this? Did you see this? How fun would it be to have more than just my perspective, but to have more of like a roundtable conversation on Zoom that then becomes a recording that each of us who did it could embed in our online course content, where students could hear a variety of faculty talking about that. And my other idea was for me to help maybe demystify academic research by asking a student if they would be available to maybe help me co-facilitate a conversation with a article author about studies that are getting more diverse voices. But then that's something that could certainly be written as a guest talk on somebody else's CV. I would want to make sure I was using people's time well and that I was reciprocating in any way that I could. I would be happy to kind of give a behind the scenes about my Obama campaign article from 2010. I have a lot of undergrads that reach out to me about that. And with it being a presidential campaign year, I'm happy to reciprocate in any way I can, but I would love to help in any way of facilitating some of those maybe roundtable perspective conversations that we could all put into content where it might be helpful.
That's a great idea. I see a lot of people in the chat saying, yes, this would be a good option. So Abby, thank you. So I think we have time for one more question. And that's from Dr. Sweetser, Kay Sweetser.
Hi, this is Kay Sweetser from San Diego State. Sorry, I'm not camera ready. It's actually just more of a comment to back up to some of the resources and kind of requests that were already mentioned, and they were mentioned in chat, but I know not everybody looks at that. One of the things that we've been doing is trying to make everything easy for us as professors, and not just PR professors, but as mass comm professors, because we teach, intro to theory on the graduate level, which may not just be public relations. And so the Broome Center has been putting together crowdsourcing, really, which is why I'm mentioning this to you, a ton of resources with scholarship that is by Black scholars, as well as seeking speakers for a speakers bureau to include you as professors who may want to jump in and talk to someone's class. And so these are two separate different data calls and databases. And in about a month-ish, we will have them all nice and pretty, no longer on Google Sheets, up on our website. And then we're going to be sending them out to every single dean and director that we can find in the entire mass comm world in the US. Sorry, that's all my little N of 1 employee staff can do. So I would encourage you to please look at these resources. We're on Twitter for Broome Center, and we've got them all linked there, and add to them, and reach out to me if you see something that's missing, because we're just trying to get out there and to find everything we can and then put it up so that when you're making your syllabus next month for the fall semester, you have these resources, and none of us have that, it's too hard, I can't find it, or I don't know where to start. It's all right there for you, sorted and able to be cataloged. Sorry, thanks.
Awesome, thank you. That's going to be a great resource. We've got a couple of minutes left, so I wanted, instead of asking, I know we had a couple of questions in the chat, but I wanted to turn it back over to Nneka, Stephanie, and Natalie to see if you had any final thoughts before we wrap it up.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm just so gratified to see is that these are not just one-off conversations, that they will be continuing. So I am down to collaborate, continue in any way, and learn from and grow from and support everyone as we walk through this journey together as scholars, and also as people charged with the responsibility of educating the next generation of PR scholars and practitioners. The issue of race has been central for so long, but often overlooked. And I think we should, embrace the fierce urgency of now, as Dr. King once said, and figure out what meaningful change we can make through our own abilities as scholars.
Nneka, I'll echo your sentiments. Just very glad that we're having these conversations. I mean, without this panel, I wouldn't have met you or Stephanie, and just having the opportunity to build these relationships among each other and support each other, I think on this path to be better educators for our students. I'm excited to continue the conversation. And I did want to share one quick resource. Starting tomorrow, the Academics for Black Lives is putting on week-long sessions, and there's a session for Black educators and there's a session for non-Black educators. And it's 7 days of sessions, and you can opt into one day or a whole week. I'll be participating over the weekend and just thought that it might be helpful or interesting for anyone who might want to join as well.
And I just echo everything that's been said. Very grateful for this opportunity to participate in the conversation. Very glad the conversation is even being had and will continue to be had. And just sort of encouraging all of us not to get tired, right? Like I think this has been, you know, ongoing, not just for the last month, you know, for those of us that are people of color, we've been living this, you know, for forever, right? So now's not the time to get tired. This is just the beginning. And as was mentioned in the first session, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And so let's pace ourselves, but let's stay committed to the cause.
Great, thank you, Stephanie, and thank you to all three panelists today for this discussion. Fantastic panel and a great discussion. And to piggyback on what Stephanie just said, Tina and I have been in conversations, and we think that we're going to be able to hopefully continue this kind of series monthly, ongoing, so that we can keep the marathon going. The next panel is next Thursday, same time, same place, and our panelists are Bailing Shaw, Damian Waymer, and Rochelle Ford. And we're talking more about the systemic long-term, how do we diversify our faculty? How do we diversify the pipeline? More of the long-term systemic questions. So we're looking forward to hearing from those three panelists next Thursday, and we will have more information soon about possible ongoing panels with that. But thank you all for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.